Okay, now that it is 1:30, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you so much everyone for coming to this training, the last one in our CDBG pre-application training series. My name is Rosie Goldich, and I'm the CDBG coordinator here at Department of Commerce. And today we have Matt Blank and Mackenzie Espeland, who will be providing this training on Criteria 7. So take it away.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. Yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. Just a little background on me. I've been with Department of Commerce for 5 years now and working with CDBG. So I'm really excited that we're doing these trainings, and I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the time. There is going to be time at the end. So if you want to pop questions in the chat or just save them, we're going to have plenty of time to get to any of those. I think we can go to the first slide. Just a little agenda today. It's pretty straightforward since we're only doing the one criterion. We're going to go over the criteria, how it's scored. We're going to give some examples of each range of scores, what kind of required documentation we're looking for. And then, like I said, we're going to have time at the end for questions and discussion. Okay, so very wordy slide for our criteria. Criterion 7 is worth a total of 175 points. And what we're looking at is how is this project going to be implemented, managed throughout the life cycle, and is it achievable? So as you can see, I'll kind of read through these. One of the bullet points for this is, has the applicant clearly demonstrated that the project is feasible, achievable? Have you taken into consideration the nature of the project activities, size, resources of the community, the budget, and the implementation schedule? Is this project plan sound and appropriate for assuring management of the CDBG project? So that would include financial management of the grant funds, compliance with all the state and federal requirements that come into play with CDBG grants, and then is this going to be a cost-effective completion of your proposed project activities? The next bullet point is, if you're awarded CDBG funds, are you going to be ready to implement the project? That could include the firm commitment of funds of all non-CDBG sources within 9 months of the grant award. Can you demonstrate that? The next one is whether the applicant or subrecipient has considered all environmental, regulatory, and technical issues which could impact the timely startup and completion of project activities. The soundness of the applicant or subrecipient's entities plans for assuring effective operation and long-term management of any assisted public or community facility. So thinking about, is this project, once built, going to be sustainable for the years to come in the community? There will be some consideration of the applicant's performance on past CDBG funded projects, if you've had them, making sure that the project is compliant with the Uniform Relocation Act requirements, which may not affect every project, but if it does affect your project, is very, very important. And then making sure there's documentation with accompanying narrative to explain. So if there's documentation or partial documentation without accompanying narrative to explain an incomplete process or responses for any of the below are not supplied, the scoring of the criteria may be reduced. So kind of a wordy way to say, are you supporting all of your answers with sound and appropriate documentation? And I think we can move to the next slide. And these are the levels that that's broken out by. So we go from a level 5 to 0. Starting at the top, a level 5 is if you have very complete narration, thoroughly addresses the entire criterion, a lot of substantive, complete documentation to support your narrative. Level 4 is solid narration with strong documentation to support its claims. Maybe you're missing something here or there. Level 3, you have adequate narrative. You're meeting the minimum requirements and your documentation is acceptable, but it's not rising to that level of 4. For a 2, you may have some narrative addressing the overall criterion, but responses or documentation is considered weak, inadequate, below average. The minimum requirements for responding to this criterion are not entirely met. So that's when we're getting into missing multiple documents, not answering questions fully. For level 1, this is a serious weakness in narrative responses and lack of critical supporting documentation, a lack of sufficient information regarding several critical questions. This is where if we're getting to the point where we can't understand what the long-term implementation and management of the project is going to be because of the lack of narrative and documentation, that's kind of where this level 1 is falling. And then 0 is just if there's no response of any kind. So no documentation, didn't address the questions or narrative, that could cause the score to fall to a 0. Next slide, please. So we'll start with those kind of lower scores. 0 is pretty obvious. That's just not even addressing anything. When this is kind of talking in that level 1 to 2 area. So if you did not respond to many of the questions or prompts, if you had past performance on former CDBG funded projects was limited or did not go well, that could impact that score. If you have environmental, regulatory, and technical issues, which could impact your project that were not considered or talked about in this criteria, that could impact your scores. If you did not demonstrate to the review committee that this project will be able to be completed successfully, that would fall under this criteria. If there was no plan for the management of the project, so that includes the financial management, the compliance with state and federal requirements, and cost effectiveness that we had talked about. And the project is not ready to implement if awarded funds, so not having firm commitment of all non-CDBG funds and resources within 9 months of the grant award. And I just want to add, if you don't have, say, 1 or 2 of these things, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to be in that 1 to 2 level. It's kind of this holistic look at implementation and management overall. So if you're kind of hitting all of these points right here, you can expect to see a lower score. So for example, let's go to the second bullet. Past performance on former CDBG funded projects is limited or not go well. We understand there's going to be communities and counties that potentially have never had a CDBG funded project. That is not going to detrimentally affect your score so much that you're automatically going to get a 1 or a 2. It's looking at this holistic picture and all of these items to help inform that score. So I think we're ready to go to the next slide with some examples. Okay, so say you have filled out your pre-application environmental checklist. This is the screenshot on the left sample, and you've gone through there, you've looked at all the categories, and you are doing an internal school rehab, we'll say. So for number 1, you put no impact. Hazardous facilities, no impact. Surrounding air quality, no impact. Groundwater resources, no impact. Your project's not anticipated to have any impacts on these items. What is missing here is you still have to enter some of the current conditions and if there's an alternative. So we need a little bit of narrative and documentation to support why you're saying there's going to be no impact to the physical environment. For soil suitability, it could be as simple as saying in the school example, no soil will be disturbed. This is an interior project only. For hazardous facilities, you could say there are no chemical, petrochemical storage tanks, underground fuel storage tanks, and related facilities within 1 mile of our school, and provide a map as documentation. Same with if we go down to groundwater resources and aquifers. If you're doing a heating and cooling project for a school, you have no impact. That may be true, but you need to say why that is. Why is it going to have no impact? So noting that there's going to be no increase in groundwater resource use, as this is a heating and cooling project in a school, and you're not on a sole source aquifer, and then you could provide a map. So making sure that you're supporting what you're saying with both some narrative and documentation. If we move over to the right in the implementation schedule, when the review committee is looking at the implementation schedule, we're trying to understand if the project is going to be completed in a reasonable time, but also if the project aspects have all been considered thoughtfully and the applicant knows roughly how long the project's going to take and kind of the steps required in that. So in this example, in the first quarter of 2023, there's a lot going on. So everything from final design all the way down to issuing a notice to proceed to contractor. This process can take potentially months or more, because if you're awarded a CDBG grant, there are startup conditions, contracting conditions. You have to go through an environmental process before you can even go out to bid. And so then we have construction starting in that next quarter and also going very quickly. And as we all know, construction projects right now typically taking a lot longer than we would hope and like. But that wouldn't be reasonable to assume that for most projects, you're going to be able to begin construction and then have final inspection within a 2 or 3 month period. And so closeout is noted as 2024. The implementation schedule, one we look at, we just want to make sure it looks reasonable. This one is on a very, very tight timeline, which when we look at this, we say, okay, they're not really understanding the scope and magnitude of what this project is going to take to be completed. Again, doesn't necessarily mean the score is going to be low just because of this, or even these two documents. It's a holistic look at kind of all the things we were talking about within that category. And I think we can go to the next slide. And I think I'm going to hand this over to Matt to go over kind of those mid-range scores now.
Thank you, Mackenzie. And one little thing for me is I'm also with CDBG, but I am on the public facility side. So I typically deal in the larger projects. So it's kind of interesting because like with that implementation schedule example there, for one of our projects, like with that example, that isn't even close to realistic because ours are quite a bit larger scale than the community facilities examples. So there's quite a bit of variance too, which makes CDBG very interesting. But now moving on to what gives adequate scores. For the environmental, having the checklist complete and having some consideration into many of the aspects, but not necessarily all of them. And some of the regulatory and technical issues that can come up with that. This could potentially have some situations where there's not quite everything is considered, especially as big as environmental can be. That's where you can kind of end up in these middle scores with that. And then also be able to demonstrate that the project is feasible. This also kind of ties back into the implementation, but there's various things. If a budget and scope don't line up, where budget doesn't seem like it would be enough to cover the scope that's being talked about, or it's trying to be put into a time frame that doesn't seem realistic. There's various factors that can show whether or not a project is actually feasible. So at the mid-range scores, we're not going to have any issues on that. And then having a solid plan to manage the CDBG project, and that kind of ties into the past performance, if applicable, because as you work through CDBG, you kind of realize like one of the things that gets touched on a lot in the preparedness is environmental, and the environmental process is pretty substantial. So if a past grantee has been able to show that they've gotten through that smoothly in the past, that can be a thing that will help bring those scores up. And then another aspect that's with CDBG that's a little bit lengthier than many of the other funding sources used with our projects is the Uniform Relocation Act, which that varies from project to project. With the public facilities projects, it's usually situations where a well site, there will need to be land purchase for like a well site or lagoon site for wastewater treatment or something along those lines. With the community facilities, sometimes it can actually be displacing residents. So that's another one that has a pretty big range depending on the type of project. Like an example with a lot of our projects will just be replacing water lines or manholes and sewer lines where it's all in land that's owned by a city. So that's an example where there's not going to be nearly as much to that one, but having a plan in place to make sure that that requirement is being met is always helpful. And then also having firm commitment of funds for at least some of the funding sources and then being able to get those within 9 months. Okay, next slide. And then ones that can warrant higher scores is going above and beyond in any of those categories. With environmental, being able to have it into a position where it's more than just the checklist complete. A good example could be to have that checklist complete with all of the backup documentation, and possibly be ready to start going into public comment periods. That way we can review everything and be able to look at it and be able to okay that to go through the public comment periods rather than just having the base checklist and have to still backfill all that supporting documentation. And then similarly on the URA requirements, having that in place. And then if there is going to be anything more major like that with a land purchase or any sort of relocation of residents or anything like that, having that plan in place. And then also commitment of funds for as many of the funding sources as possible. This has been a little bit different as of late because with ARPA, a lot of that money is already in place. So there's a little bit more capability to have that fully committed versus the past when a lot of those funds were replaced with loans that have a little bit longer turnaround to get put into place. So it's a little bit different. And then as ARPA funds kind of phase back out and we go back into loans, it'll kind of change back to the way it used to be where we don't necessarily have everything in place because, as I mentioned, the loans usually kind of come last. And then one of the last parts of startup is we check with local government services to check the audit and financial requirements. If the grantee is up to date on those, that is required with the Montana Code annotated. But we check that. And if that's already in place, that's also great because if there's an audit or something missing, that needs to be completed before we can actually enter contract. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is an example I pulled of what one of the better ones from one of our recent application cycles. This one had the engineering fully committed. They had done all the procurement and actually had the contract in place for their engineering services. This was one of our fairly simple ones. So they had their anti-displacement and relocation assistance plan in place. It wasn't one of the simpler ones. So it wasn't one of the situations where they were actually going to be having to relocate residents or anything, but they still had that plan fully in place. And then the environmental was far enough along that there was a resolution signed by the local government that an environmental assessment was appropriate for the project. And then I threw the budget in here because this was a good example of one that has quite a few funding sources And this one actually has everything pretty much in place that was possible in this situation because all of the ARPA funds were committed. I included one of the an example of one of the award letters because obviously the slide isn't quite big enough to get all of them in there, but they had commitment for all of the various ARPA funds and the local funds. The only ones that they didn't have were CDBG, which is what they were applying for, and MSEP and RRGL that were still in the application process. So that's pretty much the best you can do there, unless it's a situation where it's just ARPA and CDBG or something that can already be fully in place. But with that example where every single one was in place that wasn't still in process, that's the best you can possibly do there. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then here's just a little bit of a list of some of those extra items, like the letters of commitment for any funding sources. The more of those that are in place, the better. A thoroughly complete management plan, because that's part that's required for startup. So that proves that you're ahead of the game a little bit on startup. And then also, some of the smaller communities, it can be a little bit tough, but being able to have that where there's a good separation of duties and a good lineup for everything from the local government. And then also if there's engineering or grant administration's already been procured, that can also be included in there. So we can have that pretty much in place. So that's essentially a startup condition already met. And then for the procurement documentation for an engineer or architect, that's always good to have. In the case of the projects that I'm on with the public facilities, usually that's done because often the local government will stick with the same engineer that did a preliminary engineering report, which on public facilities is required to during application. So a lot of times that's done in advance on ours, but with community facilities, that isn't always necessarily the case. So having procurement for an architect, if there's something that's being done, like Mackenzie's example at the school, that's great to have. And then as complete of an environmental as possible, because the environmental process is pretty massive and there's some things that get overlooked quite frequently when going through the environmental process, because essentially each item on the checklist, almost every single one of them has backup documentation that is needed. So as much of that as is included is good, because if that's ready to go to public comment, then shortly after award, maybe even as you're going through the process of meeting startup, that environmental can be getting worked on. And the earlier that's done, the better, so that it doesn't hold up bidding or anything like that in the long run. And then the preliminary engineering or architectural report, as I mentioned, the engineering reports for the larger scale projects are always included. Architectural reports aren't necessarily, depending on the size of the project, but having those in place is always good. And then also having them up to date, because occasionally we'll see engineering reports that had been done early on in a project. And then if this is, say, a third or fourth phase where that engineering report was meant to cover all the phases, and then you were having the phases take a year and a half or so a piece. So by the time applications are coming around, that engineering report is getting to the point where it's getting 5 or 6 years old. It's nice to have updates or possible amendments to that, especially because anything with cost estimates and things like that, especially now, it's nice to be able to have that more up to date, especially if this kind of crazy bidding environment stays the way it is now, moving forward. And then having that budget and implementation schedule that's complete, with supporting narrative and timelines. And as we mentioned with that example, that was a lower tier on the implementation schedule, having it be reasonable, because obviously essentially every type of CDBG project is going to have a fairly decent time frame because the environmental can take quite a while. And then when you're into the bigger projects where construction alone is going to take a few months. Having a reasonable timeline in there is always good and something that seems in line with the scope of the project. And then also the potential of any environmental site assessments. These aren't always necessary. This just depends as if there is more contamination or something in an area, those can come up. But if that is something that is necessary on the project, being ahead on those is another thing that's good. And then the Uniform Acquisition Act with the relocation plan is always helpful to be ahead on, because whether it be something as small as, like I mentioned, where you just have to buy a small chunk of land for a well, or you're full on having to relocate the residents of a couple of city blocks or something, having a plan for that is always good. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And do we have any questions?
And if you don't want to speak on the Zoom, feel free to put a question in the chat. About environmental budgets, implementation schedule.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions or hearing any. Feel free, you can always contact us with any questions. Our email is doccdd@mt.gov. That's doccdd@mt.gov. Oh, we've got a question. Joan asked, when does community development make decisions on grant recipients? Is the date that starts the 9 months?
So I think what we're referring to is meeting startup. And so when you get awarded, that's when the 9 months is triggered for meeting startup conditions. So that means we want to be contracted with our grantees within 9 months of the award letter. And that's where we're getting, you need to have the firm commitment of funds within that 9 months. You'll have to make sure your budget and implementation schedule are up to date. There's some forms that we require if you're awarded to meet startup. So that's the trigger for that is once you get the award letter, the 9 months begins. We quickly follow that up with startup letters and start working with you on getting contracted between us and the grantee.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. These trainings have been recorded and they will be posted on our website, which is comdev.mt.gov. And you can go and visit the presentations there, and those should be posted by the end of the week. But if there are no further questions or comments or anything, I will let you all go. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming today.